Welcome back. In this video we're going to add Windspeed. This will be the control signal for our wind sound effect. The Windspeed has two main components. First there's the average speed, and for this we'll use the Beaufort scale. And then there are additional peaks such as gusts and squalls, and we'll also add those. A gust is typically a very short increase in wind speed, less than 20 seconds, whereas a squall is something that lasts much longer and is a little bit more spiky. As I said, for the average speed we'll use the Beaufort scale. Rather than exposing the bandpass filter cutoff and resonance to the gain, what we will do is we will expose an integer which represents the average wind speed based on the Beaufort scale. In this chart on the right hand side I've defined what our mean speed will be for the various Beaufort scale levels, and on the far right is the standard deviation of that wind speed. So the random variation of wind speed within that scale. Before, when we generated white noise, we used a uniform distribution, so all values had an equal probability of occurring. However, in nature that's not often the case, and particularly with wind speed, where the wind speed will tend to occur around a mean, but can on rare occasions be quite extreme. So what we're going to use here is a normal distribution. In a normal distribution, 68% of the values will come within one standard deviation, plus or minus one standard deviation of the mean. 95% within plus or minus two standard deviations, and almost 100% between plus or minus three standard deviations. Although more extreme values are still possible. In fact, it's unbounded and can go to infinity. So we'll have to consider that within our code. As I have when I first wrote this, it did have a crash which was caused by a very rare high value. So in this case, the controls we will expose to the game are the average speed, which will be an integer running from 0 to 12, representing the Beaufort scale. And then we'll have some controls which control the gust and squall, basically a ball to turn them on and off, a float which will control the depth, the amount of the gust, and for the gust we'll have another float which controls the interval between gusts, or the interval between squalls. Back to Xcode. I've called this project Win for Unity 2, so you can download this one separately from the last project we've done. The first thing I've done is a bit of a code tidy, because there was a lot of unnecessary code, boilerplate code, that Juice had put in. So what I've done here is I'll show you what's left now within the CPP. And what we've done, we've moved this code into the .h file, which I'll show you in a second. We have to, because these are pure virtual functions, therefore they must be defined, but there's not much to define in them, so we've just included the definition in the h file. So we still have the constructor. We left that as is. Then we'll have the destructor, prepare to play method. I've left in the release resources method, as this may be needed later if we define certain types of data which we may have to release back to memory. Obviously the process block, this is the main block, we've left that in the CPP file. I've left the has editor and the create editor. This is where we're defining the generic audio processor editor. Also, I've left the private methods such as DST prepare, DST process, DST update settings, and that's all that's left now in the CPP file. Now we'll have a quick look at what's happening in the .h file. As you can see here, the isbuses layout supported at the bottom. What I've done is I've moved the return false into that code there. So in the curly brackets we have return false semicolon. Next we go down to the section with get name, accepts MIDI, produces MIDI, is a MIDI effect, and get tail length in seconds. So here we're returning the Juice plugin name. We've moved that into here in curly brackets for the get name. and accepts MIDI, produces MIDI, and is MIDI effect. We've included return false because we're not doing anything with MIDI. And get tail length seconds, we're returning 0. The next section, we've got get num programs. The get num programs will return 1. The get current program returns 0. Set current program, we just leave empty curly brackets. And get program name, again, we return an empty value in the curly brackets. And the change program name, we just have the blank curly brackets. Then we move down further. Again, get state information and set state information. We just leave those as blank curly brackets. So we add the curly brackets here. And the rest is as was. Okay, so let's now get back to our new program. What we're going to do here is, first of all, we're going to add and test the average wind speed. So we're going to add two methods. One is a method which returns a float, which is random normal. This is going to be our random number generator to produce the normal distribution of random numbers. And then we're going to have a wind speed set method. Now we move down to the distant wind parameters. We'll comment out the DST BP cutoff rec and the DST BPQ, the resonance, because we're not going to expose those as parameters anymore. And what we'll add is a wind speed parameter now, which will be a juice audio parameter float integer this time, so int pointer wind force. What we now need to do is to define the random number generator, so the RNG. What I've done here is added from the C++ standard library, the standard normal distribution. And I'm returning a double here rather than a float, and I'm going to call that distribution. We're not initializing it here, we'll initialize it within the constructor. So we just have the empty curly brackets at the end. And then I want to define a generator, which is again from the standard C++ library. So std : default random engine. So that's how we're going to be generating using the C++ default random engine, and we'll call that generator. Below that, I've included the wind speed array. So if you remember from the chart, I have the mean wind speed and the standard deviation of the wind speed. So what you see here is two float arrays, just standard arrays, mean WS and SDWS. Both of the array sizes are 13, and then we can see the numbers defined afterwards. So our wind speed runs from 0.0 to 34. They're all in meters per second, and the standard deviations run from 0 to 4.25. At the top of the header file, what we'll have to do is to include random. So you'll see hash include angle brackets random. This is for the C++ standard library, normal distribution and random number generator. So if we move over to the CPP file in the constructor right at the top, obviously we comment out the DST BPF cutoff rec and the DST BPQ because we don't have those anymore. And at the bottom we add a new parameter, which is our wind force. So we've got add parameter wind force, new juice : audio parameter int, and we call this one wind force. So we have wind force. We know it runs from 0 to 12. So our first number is 0, our second number is 12, and we'll set the default value to be 3. And then at the bottom of the constructor, we need to set up the random number generator. So we're going to seed the random number generator here. If we put it in the constructor, we seed it once, which is good. You only want to seed a random number generator once. There are various reasons for that. But we create an integer seed, and we make that equal to the current clock time. So standard chrono system clock now dot time since epoch dot count. That will give us a different integer every time, And then we call our generator and we set the seed. So generator.seed brackets seed. And then we'll initialize our Windspeed. So we'll call the Windspeed set method during the initialization. Now we clear up the various errors we've got. If you go down to DST prepare, obviously that has set cutoff frequency based on the audio parameters that we had. Obviously we haven't got those audio parameters anymore, so we're going to have to change these two. So what I do is I'll just comment them out and we'll add a couple of values for those. We'll just initialize them with a cutoff of 10 and a resonance of 1. So if we head over to the header file, we'll create some internal variables. The first one is I'm going to store the current spec because we're going to be using various values out of that, such as sample rate, in other parts of our program now. So it's going to be useful to have a local copy. So we'll declare a juice, : DSP, : process spec, current spec. So if you remember in the prepare to play, we create the spec. This will be stored now locally. Next we have the current wind speed, so a float which is current wind speed, and we'll initialize that to 0. Then we'll have a float delta wind speed. Now this covers the average value, so the wind speed will be varying constantly. What we'll do is we'll update this every frame, and the wind speed will keep moving upwards, downwards, and create a nice random effect. So what we'll do is we'll declare a delta wind speed, and that will be how much it changes every frame, and we'll initialize that to 0. Then next we have another float which is target wind speed. What this will be is every time we get to our target, we'll set a new target and we'll calculate a new delta wind speed. So the target wind speed is indicating when the delta wind speed should finish, and a new target wind speed should be calculated. And then we have a couple of integers. Now what this is, I've called current wind speed component counter. This is counting the number of frames over which the wind speed should change. And the target component count is the point at which it's finished reaching that, so it should recalculate the deltas and the new current component counter or reset. So what we're doing here is, this is a frame counter and it's set every time that we reset the current wind speed. So when it hits its target wind speed, we'll recalculate the current wind speed component counter and the target wind speed component count. We'll see that later when we define the methods. Back to the CPP file. If we look at DST update settings, obviously again we called the audio parameters, and we don't want to do that this time. We're going to be using the wind speed. So this is how we fix that. This is going to be our first attempt. This will change. And what you're seeing here, if current wind speed is less than 0, current wind speed equals 0. Now this is where I was saying where we have the normal random values coming. We could get a minus wind speed, which obviously we don't want. Doesn't make any sense. So we'll check for that and set it to 0. We'll then calculate the cutoff frequency, and what we'll do here is we'll multiply the current wind speed by 30 and add 0.004. Now this is again making sure it doesn't go to 0. If you remember, I preferred it to go to 0.004. So this is creating 0.004 as our minimum. And then resonance, what we're going to do is take the current wind speed and set it to say 0.2 times the current wind speed, and then add a factor of 0.01 again, so it doesn't go down to 0. Next, in the CPP file, we'll adjust the prepare to play method. And what I'm doing here is I'm setting the current spec. If you remember in the internal variables, I said we wanted to store a copy of the spec, and this is what we're doing. So current spec equals spec. So now we'll create our new methods. We've got random normal and we've got wind speed set. Random normal is really easy. what we do is we return the distribution which uses the generator. So the call is just return distribution brackets generator, and that will give us our random normal value. Calculating the wind speed is a little bit more complex. Next, in the wind speed set method, the way this works is we will set a target wind speed, and then we will set a target wind speed component count. Now what this is the number of frames it will take to reach the target wind speed. So what you'll see there, you'll always see current spec.sample rate divided by the current spec.maximum block size. So this basically converts seconds to frames. So the first thing we do is we get the force, the current force that's set within the game. So int force equals wind force arrow operator get, again our thread safe method of getting the wind force. If the force is 0, we just set the target wind speed to 0, and the target wind speed components count, what we'll do is set that to 1 second. So if the wind speed is 0, every second it will check to see if the wind force has changed. So you'll see target wind speed component count is current spec.sample rate over current spec.maximum block size cast to an integer, because obviously a count is an integer. If it's not 0, then we will calculate the target wind speed based on our random number generator. So we'll take the mean wind speed from the array, so mean wind speed square brackets force, and then we'll add the standard deviation to it. So the standard deviation SD wind speed force times random normal. So we'll take a random normal number. The next one, we calculate the time over which this wind speed will change. So we calculate the target wind speed component count to 10 seconds plus 2 times the standard deviation, effectively by taking a new random normal. And what we'll do is we'll divide that by the force divided by 2, which means that the random nature will increase as the force increases. And again, we multiply that by current spec.sample rate divided by current spec.maximum block size to turn our seconds into frames. Then we reset our current wind speed component counter to 0. Then we calculate our delta wind speed, which is the target wind speed minus the current wind speed, so the amount of wind speed we need to change, divided by the float cast target wind speed component count, so the number of frames over which we need to change the wind speed to hit its target. Then we'll go up to the process block, and here we'll just add a very simple statement that we'll increment the current wind speed component counter every time it goes through the frame. So if ++ current wind speed component counter is greater than the target, then we'll reset the wind speed. Else, the current wind speed will be incremented by the delta wind speed. So what we're doing here is we're counting through the frames. When we've hit the target, then we'll reset the wind speed. Otherwise, we'll just be incrementing the wind speed with the delta wind speed. And that's it. We can build now. So if we build this project as a standalone, you should see this. Now if you run this, what you'll hear is a very gentle change of wind speed. You'll hear the filters open and close and the resonance change. If you change the wind force, obviously, it sounds more windy. Now we'll add the gust and squall. If you go back to the header file, the first thing I'm going to do is to add an enum. This will control the gust status, so we know if it's off, waiting, active, closing. And what we've got here is if there's no gust, then we won't add a gust component. That's if it's not active. Then there's waiting, which is it's waiting for the next occurrence of the gust. So it's active, but it's not gusting at the moment. Then we've got the situation where it's active, where we've actually got the gust running. And then we have a closing status, which allows us to smoothly close the gust rather than a sudden drop of wind speed. Now we add our new methods. This is a little more complex, so we've got quite a few additional methods to add here. The first is compute gust. This will use the status of the gust to know what to do at any particular point in time. The next is gust set, which is very much like Windspeed set and Squall set. Then we'll have a gust close method. Then we need to calculate the interval between gusts. So we have a gust interval set. Then we have a gust length set. So this is how long the gust goes on for. And also we'll have a squall length set because the variables in there are slightly different. And I've included it as a different method just to make it simpler in the code. We'll need some more audio parameters to control the gust, as we said in the very early slides. So we declare 5 new variables that we're going to expose to the game. So we're going to have juice audio parameter bool this time as a pointer, as gust active. So this will be a setting to say we want gusts to occur. And then we'll have a juice audio parameter float pointer, which will be the depth of the gust, so the amount of gust that we want. And then we have a juice audio parameter float, which is the interval between gusts. So we can change the likelihood of a gust occurring. And then we have a juice audio parameter bool, which says whether or not the squall's active. And finally, a juice audio parameter float pointer, which is the squall depth. Then again, in the header file, we'll add some more internal variables. So we need the current gust speed. This will control the gust and the squall, and the delta gust and the target gust, very similar to the way we controlled the average wind speed. And then we need the component counter, the current gust component counter and the target gust component counter. Now this is the individual ups and downs of the gusts. Then we need a current gust length counter and a target gust length counter. This is counting how long the gust will last for. Again, very similar way that we did it before. And then we have a final set of counters, which is a current gust interval counter and a target gust interval counter. This is the gap between the gusts because obviously they're not running continuously. So this is calculating the interval between when we switch the gust on or off. Then we declare our enum, our gust status. So gust status is called gust status. So we're storing the state at which the gust is. And then I have a little one, which is a bool gust was active. This is needed to detect if this is the first time that a gust is registered. And we'll see that in operation through the methods. So we need to initialize these parameters. So in the CPP constructor, we'll add parameter for the gust active. So this is the audio parameter bool. We'll call this gust active, and our default value for this is false. Then we'll have gust depth. We'll just run these from 0 to 1 because we know that within Unity it's just going to do 0 to 1. So we'll have 0 to 1 here, and we can change the factors for these separately. So we'll have a gust depth is a new audio parameter float called gust depth. This set from 0 to 1, and we'll have an initial value, default value of 0.5. Then next we have gust interval, again gust float, much the same, called gust interval. We'll run that from 0 to 1 and default of 0.5. Squall active is the next one. Again, this is an audio parameter bool called squall active. That's what will appear in Unity, and we'll set that to false as by default. And then finally we've got the squall depth, so the amount of squall, the ferociousness of the squall if you like. Again, we'll run that from 0 to 5 with a default of 0.5. Next we'll move down to the process block, and what we'll do here is we'll add a few lines to control the gust. So if the gust is active or the gust status is closing, now what this is doing is making sure you're covering the situation where the gust active has been switched off but the gust is still closing, so you don't get a sudden movement of wind speed. So what we're saying here is the gust is actually making a noise. At that stage we'll go to the compute gust method. If not, and gust status is active, so what we're saying here is if the gust status is active but the gust active bool is false, then we'll close down the gust. So we'll go to gust close. Next we go down to the DST update settings, and here we just need to add the current gust. So this is adding to the wind speed. So the wind speed will be the sum of the current wind speed, which is the average wind speed, plus the gust. So if you see here, what I've done is within the brackets of the set cutoff frequency, I've added plus current gust for both frequency and resonance. Compute gust is a little bit complicated, so what I've done here is I've just set out what we're going to do. And this is the thing as I was mentioning before about if it's the first time we've just run the program, what we'll do is we'll set the interval and then return. Then if the gust status is waiting, we'll check to see if the interval is at its end, and if it is, we'll set the gust squall component. If it's active, then we'll close if it's got to the end of the length. And if it's closing, we'll check to see if it's closed, and if it is, then we'll return and change the various parameters that we need to change. So these are the four things: if it's the first time, if we're waiting, if we're active, or if we're closing. So if this was the first time that we've entered compute gust, we check if not gust was active, i.e. was active is false, then we'll set the interval and return, so we'll get out of compute gust. If the gust status is waiting, then we'll check the interval counter, the gust interval counter, and we'll increment the interval counter. If we've hit the target and squall is active, so with squall active we'll get that thread safe, then the squall will be set and the squall length will be set. If the squall isn't active, obviously we've then just got an ordinary gust, so we'll gust set and then gust length set and return. If the gust is active, what we'll do is we'll check to see if we're at the end of the gust. So we'll increment the gust counter, and if we're now greater than the target gust length count, we'll close the gust. This is our nice smooth way of dealing with closing gusts, and return. If not, we'll do a second check to see if the gust has reached the end of its component. If the gust is still running, then we'll check to see if the gust component, remember this is the individual little spikes within the gust, so we'll increment the current gust component counter and check to see if we're at the end of the component. If we are, we'll check to see if squall is active. If it is, we'll reset the squall, else we'll set the gust. And if that's not the case, then we'll increment the current gust with the delta gust and then return. If gust status is closing, we'll increment the current gust component, so the individual spike. This will be the final spike, so it'll be heading down towards to 0. If it's got to 0, we'll set the gust was active to false, set the gust status to off, and the current gust will make sure it's 0. You probably don't need to do that, it should be 0 anyhow, and then return. But if not, what we'll do is we'll carry on incrementing the delta gust so we can wait until it's finished. Now we get on to the gust set methods. First of all, we get our wind force get again, so we find out what the wind force is. If the wind force is less than 3, what I'm going to say is we'll have gusts close. If the wind force is less than 3, we don't want to have gusts. So gusts can only occur with the wind force of 3 and above. If that's the case, then we calculate our target gust. Now our target gust is going to be 10 times the depth, the gust depth. So we have 10 times gust depth, get again thread safe, plus 2 times the standard deviation times the random normal. So this will give us our target gust, much the same as our wind speed gust we did earlier. And then we calculate the target gust component count, so how long this gust component will last for. So we'll cast this to an integer, and it'll be 1 plus 0.25 random normal. So what we're saying is going to be around about a second. And then we're going to adjust that for the force. So as the force is larger, we'll do an adjustment again, like we did previously. And then we'll calculate the number of frames that is, as we've sort of thought about it in seconds before. So we'll convert that to frames. Now what we do here, we'll just do a Jmax, juice Jmax. So this is the maximum value of the target gust component count and 1. Now the reason for this is that the random normal part of this is quite close to the mean, and it's possible you're going to get a negative number here. You don't want a count of minus, so we're saying the minimum count is 1. And then what we do is, much like we did for wind speed, we set the gust component counter to 0, and then delta gust is our target gust minus current gust divided by the target gust component count, i.e. the number of frames over which we want that to change. And then we set our gust status to active. Our score set method is basically the same. The only thing that's changed here is that when we calculate the target gust, so target gust equals 10 times squall depth get plus 4 times the standard deviation and the random normal value. So this is 4 times rather than 2 times, so there's going to be a greater level of variation with the target gust speed. We'll now look at the gust close method. As I said before, this is at the end of a gust, we don't want it suddenly to go to 0. We want a nice smooth transition to 0, and there are a number of occasions when that can happen, i.e. the active button has been turned to 0, or we've reached the end of the length of a gust. So what we'll do here is we set the target gust to 0, and the target gust component count, we're going to close this down over 2 seconds. So we cast to an integer, we do 2 times current spec sample rate divided by current spec maximum block size. So that will be the number of frames needed for 2 seconds. We'll reset the current gust component counter to 0. The delta gust, as it's always been, is target gust minus current gust divided by the float version of the target gust component count. So it closes down over the number of frames that we've specified, and we change the gust status to closing. Next we have our gust interval set method. The first thing we'll do is we'll reset the current gust interval counter to 0, and then we need to set our target interval count. Again, we'll cast this to an integer, and what we'll do is we'll get our gust interval, multiply that by 100 and add 5. So 5 is the minimum gap between gusts, plus or minus the 10 times the random normal. So we'll have some variation there. So what we're saying is our gust interval is set by the slider, and we'll have some random normal variation, typically plus or minus 10, and we'll have a minimum of 5. And then we convert that to frames by the current spec sample rate divided by the current spec maximum block size. Again, we'll use the juice Jmax just to make sure the interval count can't go below 1, and then we'll set the gust status to waiting, and the gust was active equals true. Next we have the gust length set method. We'll set the current gust length counter to 0 again, and the target gust length count this time will be around about 5 seconds, plus or minus 1.5 standard deviations of our random normal. So typically what you'll find is the gust length will run from, say, 2 seconds to 8 seconds, which is not too bad. And then again, we convert that seconds into frames by multiplying that by the current spec sample rate divided by the current spec maximum block size. And again, we'll use the jmax function to make sure that the gust length count doesn't go below 1. And we'll set the gust status to active. Finally, we define the Squall length set. This is very similar to the gust length set. The only difference is in the target gust length count, we will change the parameters to 30 plus 5 times the random normal. So what we're saying here is that our mean Squall length will be 30 seconds, plus or minus 10 seconds will be typical sorts of values. The rest of the code is the same as in the gust length set. You can now build this project, and this is what you should see. I just want to show you the option settings that the Juice standalone plugin creates for you. If you press on Options top left and then select Audio MIDI settings, you can change the output, sample rates and various things within the plugin so you can test it properly. I'll set the gust depth to maximum and the Squall depth to maximum and the gust interval to the minimum setting, and then we'll switch on gust active so you can hear a gust coming in. Now I'll set Squall active. While I was listening to this, I noticed that the resonance was just a little bit too much, and we just needed to adjust a few parameters. So what I'm going to do is to go into the DST update settings, and what you'll see is I'm going to change the way the cutoff and the resonance is calculated. The first thing we're going to do is to set the cutoff frequency in such a way that I've now put a limit in it. So it's a minimum of 0.004. and now a maximum of 1500. So we don't want the cutoff to go above that. And so here we can avoid some errors. This is actually where I got an error before, where the current wind speed was negative after the current wind speed and gust was added together. Then below on the resonance, you can hear the whistling. It's probably just a little bit too much. So what I've done here is added it as a log function. So the higher the wind speed, the resonance doesn't increase quite so much. It flattens off by using the log. And again, I'm using a Jmax here to make sure it never goes below 1. So if you look here, I've got the DST BPF set resonance is now a minimum of 1. And then we add the log of the current wind speed plus the current gust times 0.1. And we make sure that it never goes below 1, because if it does, we have some horrible infinities occurring with log. If we move to gust set, I've also changed the target gust and done 15 times the gust depth set this time, just to give it a little bit more oomph. And finally, I've made some adjustments to this Squall set. Again, the target gust, I've increased the figure to 20 just to give it a bit more oomph. And actually I've reduced the standard deviation down to 2 as it was just getting a bit too much. But what I've done is I've shortened the target gust component count to 0.75 so it changes more rapidly, and I think this gives a better effect. So if we rebuild the project and run, this is what you'll hear. I hope you found this video useful. In the next video, what I'm going to do is to add some layers to this effect to create a more spatial feeling to the effect. So we'll have, say, 3 bandpass filters. So we'll add some delay and some pan, so you'll feel more depth and you'll feel the wind moving across the scene. See you next time.